Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. You're tuned in to backbutton focus, exposure mode, and other debatables in nature photography. The man of the hour, Russell Graves. Russell, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Doing wonderful. Good to see you as always.
That's good to see you. Thank you for having me again.
Of course, we love you here. As if you guys haven't gotten to know Russell on our channel, head over to our YouTube page where you can watch this and all of our other recorded live content. I'm going to turn it over to Russell and invite you guys all to get your questions in over the next hour or so, and I will see you in a bit for some Q&A, Russ.
Very good. Thank you. See you soon. There we go. We're good to go. Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Russell Graves. I'm coming to you live from beautiful Hackberry Farm near Dodge City, Texas. I'm so thankful that spring has come around. I think it's my age showing, but there was a time when I was younger that I used to really like the cold weather, and I still like the cold weather when I know I'm going there. But as far as my day-to-day living, kind of like it a little bit warmer. And we had a fairly short winter and an early spring this year, so I'm thankful for that. So everything's greening up outside. It's beautiful. We've had a lot of rain, and the frogs are chirping when you go outside, and so it's a great day to be outside. But today, I'm inside with you and glad to be. Always thankful to do these webinars for B&H Photo, and always glad that the audience is attentive and has a lot of good questions. And one of the things I want to tell you before I begin is I'm usually not a very controversial person. So whenever I came up with this topic, back button focus, exposure mode, and other photography debatables and wildlife photography, it's really kind of given in the sense when I do all these photography workshops and I take people to all these cool places and we're driving around from spot to spot in a van and we're usually bringing up things in conversation. These are some of the things that I hear people talk about a lot that they kind of friendly debate about what's the best way to go. So in that spirit, that's what we're talking about today. But look, I'll be the first one to say I don't have all the answers. I've always famously said that it's not like we're solving all the world's problems by pressing a button on a camera. We're just out to have fun, take some really neat pictures and inspiring locations, and learn a little bit along the way. So that's what this presentation today is in the spirit of. And one of the things that I always talk about to people, my students included on workshops, is photography is kind of like if you look at this as Apple Maps off my phone. And so the big blue dot is where I live right here in Northeast Texas. But if I wanted to go to Broken Bow, Oklahoma, which I'm going later on today, I can I can get directions from here to Broken Bow, Oklahoma, and it'll give me three different choices from which to choose. But what do all three choices do? They give me to the same place. And that's a pretty good analogy for photography and some of the things we're going to talk about today. There's a lot of different ways you can accomplish the same thing, whether you're talking about the act of photography when you're in the field, or whether you're talking about just the post processing. And that's the beautiful thing. I mean, I encourage people all the time that my way is my way. It doesn't mean it's the right way. It doesn't mean it's the wrong way. It's just my way. And so I encourage people to figure out what your way is and really get good at your way. Because I think the path to being really good at photography and the path of being real successful at photography, not from a business standpoint, but just from an enjoyment standpoint, is just figuring out what your path is and just repeating over and over and over again. The greatest hitters in the sport of baseball, they know if they're consistent in their swing and they have the same mechanics every single time they swing, their batting average goes up. Golf is the same way. Just about any kind of activity you do, the best of the best, they figure out what their way is, the way that their mechanics of their body work the most efficiently, and then they just repeat the same moves over and over and over again. It's just called fundamentals. And to me, photography is exactly the same way. There's a lot of fundamentals in photography, and there's a lot of different things you can learn. So just learn your path and then stick to your path, and everything will turn out over and over again. And believe me when I say this, it'll increase your enjoyment of the activity. So as we talk about these things, since this is kind of a one-way conversation now, make sure you pop those questions into the chat and the Q&A, and we'll get those addressed at the end of this presentation. So we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, because I want to hear what you have to say about some of these things. I'm going to tell you what I think about them, but I really love to hear what other people have to say. Because again, there's no right or wrong answers. It's just your way or my way. And that's the beautiful thing about photography. And so number one, and I hear this a lot, are tripods and wildlife, or let's change wildlife photography. Let's say nature photography. Are tripods and nature photography outdated? And I think the answer is absolutely not. And the reason for that is simple. The reason why people say tripods are outdated because these cameras now, and I don't know the whole numbers because every camera is a little bit different, but they've got, it all started out in the original days of photography, and I've been shooting pictures for a long time. I got my first camera when I was 16. I'm 54 now. I got my first camera when I was 16, started taking pictures in earnest of just rural life, the things that I grew up a mile from where I live, the farm I live on now. And so all the stuff I see around me today is the stuff I grew up taking pictures of. And I grew up uh, taking pictures of flowers and wildlife and cattle and the people who work the land and all those things. Did it on film, did it with that old Vivitar camera that had screw mount lenses. And so I've been doing it for a while. And over time, upgraded to a better camera. Over time, upgraded to digital, DSLR, and then mirrorless. So I followed the same path that a lot of people that are listening today has followed. But early on, I noticed my pictures weren't as good as they could be, and so I asked a photography mentor friend of mine, uh, what could I be doing wrong? What could I be doing to make my pictures better? And he asked, "Are you using a tripod?" And at the time, I'm in my 20s, and I'm like, "No, I'm young and strong. I can hold those cameras still." And he's like, "You need to get a tripod." And so, true story, back in the 90s, called up this company called B&H Photo, ordered a Bogan 3221 set of legs with a ball head, and then that thing was delivered, and I started using it religiously, and it instantly made a difference on how much better my pictures were. And so I say that to say now, because technology has introduced things like uh, first lens stabilization, where they would help stabilize the lens up to 3 or 4 out of stops. I don't know the exact number. And now in body stabilization, that's combined with the lens stabilization to give you, I think I've read in some cases, up to 10 to 12 stops of stabilization uh, with the technology that's offered today. So you would tend to think that because of all this stabilization technology that's built into the cameras, that tripods will become outdated. But the fact is, they haven't. It's the most low tech piece of equipment you can have, but it's one of those pieces of equipment, in my opinion, that will yield more tangible results than almost just about anything else you can buy. Because uh, one of the reasons is the tripods, they're going to hold your camera steady. There's about 300 there's about 300 joints. I kind of jumped the gun here, so I'll explain what I'm talking about. There's about 300 joints from your toes to your hands that are conspiring against you to hold a camera steady. And the fact is, we don't like to admit it, but every one of us are getting younger. I'm probably not as strong as I was when I was in my 20s. And so the older we get, the little bit more weaker we get and the less stamina we have. And so those things conspire against holding your camera steady. And the in-body stabilization and the lens stabilization helps, but it doesn't help completely. So this support hierarchy I'm talking about is, in my mind, this is the most steady to the least steady way you can hold a camera. The most steady is, of course, a tripod, because no matter how much you shake, if you've got it on a tripod, you can eliminate all shake. And then another good advantage of a tripod is it just helps you slow down. When you're talking about wildlife photography, it'll help you slow down and compose. But when you're talking about landscape photography, having it on a tripod and being deliberate in your movements will make your pictures go from, and I hear this a lot, this phrase, this isn't a new phrase that I'm making up, but it makes your photography a little more intentional, because you have to kind of walk through the steps a little more instead of just being apt to just point and shoot. And so when you're learning photography and you're learning all these lessons about what it takes to make great pictures, uh, just that intentionality really makes a difference when you start thinking about the process and thinking about what's in your frame and moving around, moving left, moving right to improve a background or to improve a foreground, whatever it is you're doing. Tripods help slow you down and make that more intentional. So on my support hierarchy, you've got tripod first, and this is more when it comes to wildlife stuff. Beanbag second. I use a beanbag a lot. I've got a big original version of the Canon 500 millimeter f4 lens, and it's a great lens and it works great still. It's probably a 20-year-old lens now, but it's heavy. And so if I can't use a tripod, I use a beanbag a lot that I'll put over if I'm driving around in my pickup truck looking for subjects just hanging out in the field or hanging out on the fence row. The beanbag works great, so I try to use that. Monopod's another good uh, compromise. If anyone listening has ever been to Brooks Falls in Alaska to photograph the brown bears feeding at the falls, one thing you'll know is they don't allow tripods on the platform. And so then sometimes you're forced to use the monopod. Monopod is a good it's a good compromise. You watch NFL games or MLB games. A lot of times you'll see photographers on the sidelines. They're using monopods because they're quick to set up. They don't have the best stability as a tripod, but it's better than trying to handhold at the same time. It'll at least give you some stability. Other bracing like a tree or a rock, something you can just put a camera against. Uh, Handheld prone. If you think the prone position where you're laying down because you're more of your body is against the surface and then your elbows are on the ground, and handheld prone is a great way of holding that. But again, back to my earlier comment where we're not getting any younger, so sometimes it may be a little harder to get off the ground. Handheld prone may not always be a good option. Handheld sitting's the next. And then handheld standing, in my opinion, is the least stable way of holding a camera. And that's not opinion, just based on pure speculation. There's a lot of fact to that because, again, like I said earlier, when you're standing there straight up, it's your. I mean, take the camera out of your hands. Standing is the least stable way that you can even exist. I mean, you're more stable if you're sitting in a chair. You're more stable if you're laying on the ground. And so, because of that hierarchy, when you put a camera in your hands, and again, you've got those 300 joints between your toes and your fingers that are conspiring against you to hold it steady, and then the muscle fatigue that goes along with that. At some point, even though the image stabilization, in camera stabilization, and the lens stabilization is going to help, I don't think in all cases it's going to be able to outrun just inherently not being able to hold a camera steady. So back to my original point, I'll back up there. Are tripods in wildlife photography or nature photography or really just about any kind of photography outdated? I just don't think they are. That's a cool little shot. That's a catbird right there. That was in the Florida Everglades, and he showed up and was eating these little pepper berries. I think this is a Brazilian pepper tree. It's an invasive species down there. Beautiful species, but you can see that bird eating there. Let me get back through this. So yeah, if you have any questions as I go along this or as I go along or any comments for me, be sure to pop them in there. And of course, all these are taken using a tripod. I'm just a firm believer in tripods. Here's another debatable for you. What's the best exposure mode? Because you'll hear, and I disagree with this too, you'll hear people say often in the educational circles that you're not a real photographer or you're not an accomplished photographer, or you can think of any superlative to put in, you're not a blank photographer unless you shoot in manual mode. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that because I think if you've got the camera, if you're using the camera and you think of it like a tool, it's best to understand how that tool works from a basic and a fundamental standpoint. So, like me, when I was learning photography, it was all manual for me. So that's how I learned. And one thing that shooting in manual really did for me was it taught me to really understand shutter speed, understand ISO, and understand aperture, and how all three of those things play against one another to create a proper exposure that you're going to get in the field. And so, fast forward, is that the best exposure mode? Well, over time, I kind of learned that for me, it wasn't, because manual exposure, even though I knew how to use it and I was adept at using it, still am, it wasn't the best exposure mode for me because it was a little bit slower. I'll explain more about that in just a minute. So here's a rundown of what the different exposure modes are. Program mode: camera sets the aperture and shutter speed. It's kind of the dummy mode. You set it on P mode or whatever it is for your particular camera. I'm using the nomenclature that Canon cameras use, not to endorse Canon cameras necessarily, saying they're any better than any other ones. That's just what I use. So those are the cameras that I'm the most familiar with, even though I'm familiar with all the brands of cameras. But the program mode is probably for me the least valuable mode because it just limits how much creative control you have over the image. But you'll see some people argue that shutter priority mode is best when you set the shutter speed and the camera sets the aperture, and that is valuable in some cases. Aperture priority is where you set the aperture and the camera sets the shutter speed. And then manual, you set both the aperture and the shutter speed yourself. And by the way, you set all the ISO yourself on all of these. And so it's one of those things that goes back to that map I showed you earlier. All three or any four of these modes, let's just leave program mode out of it. Shutter priority, aperture priority, manual priority. Any three of those modes are like the map I showed you earlier. They'll get you to the same place if you know how to read them, if you know how to use them properly. They'll all get you to the same place, and that same place is a proper exposure. But for me, I'm going to show you this. I prefer aperture priority. I think for wildlife photography, aperture priority is the best, and allow me to explain a little bit more in a minute. But let's look at this graph right here. So this is a rundown idea. There's a really cool program, and I use Mac computers, and I'm not sure if this is available for PC, but there's a really cool software program called Photo Statistica. And about once every couple of months, I'll just run a report to look at the metadata in my images. But what Photo Statistica does is it does a deep dive in your metadata on your images, and it will tell you things like, here's the time of the day you shoot most often, or here's the day of the week, and you can combine all the different data that your camera collects every time you take a picture. Photo Statistica will go through, crunch that data, and then give you a graphical output. You can do pie charts, you can do donut charts, line charts, graphs, all kinds of stuff. And it's really fun to go and kind of do a deep dive and really have a better understanding of how you shoot. And so one of the things I knew anecdotally, because I prefer aperture priority, is I knew I shot a lot of my pictures aperture priority, but when I did the rundown on this, and I don't know if it says, no, it doesn't say it on this graph, but this represents 702,000 images in my Lightroom catalog that are in my files that I ran. And you can see here, shutter priority was 1% of the time, program was 3% of the time. And what that means is, what I think that came from is likely because I've got some iPhone pictures in my catalog. So I think that's picking those up, because I mean, I never use, in fact, I take it off my list of exposure modes now on my cameras, that because you can go into the custom settings and tell your camera just to show the program modes you want it to use. So I take that off. So I don't use program mode. Maybe some pictures I've taken in the past or my wife might have used my camera or something, that's showing up somehow. But manual mode makes up 15% of the pictures that I've taken. But aperture priority, looky there, 81% of the pictures I've ever taken out of 702,000 were taken on aperture priority. So if I'm to believe what people say is you're not an advanced photographer, or you're not worth your salt as a photographer, you don't use manual mode, right there is I'm debunking it. I'm a one-man debunker of that notion, because I'm a professional photographer. Not only do I lead workshops, that's kind of the latest iteration what I do, but I've spent a lifetime taking pictures for magazines and commercial clients. I've had hundreds of magazine covers, and 81% of those pictures I've ever shot were taken on aperture priority. And the reason for why I think the aperture priority is the superior mode for shooting pictures of wildlife is because it's a time saver. You know, one of the things about shooting pictures of wildlife, you got to be ready for the action. And so for me, and again, this is my view, it's not universal. I'm not saying this is the only way you have to shoot, but for me, and the way I work is, if I can have one less dial to turn when the action's starting to unfold in front of me, the fewer mistakes I make. And so really, when I set my camera up for action, I'll set the ISO, and I'll talk about in a minute why I'm not a fan of auto ISO. I'll set the ISO. I'll set the aperture already, because one of my signature looks I try to achieve is, and the reason why I shoot a 500 millimeter f4 is I love the way the out of focus areas look in those pictures. So I'll open my aperture wide open, say f4, f5.6. And then because that I choose the ISO, I choose the aperture. And because I've got it on aperture priority, the camera selects the shutter speed that matches what I've already dialed into it. So when the action happens in front of me, all I've got to do is raise the camera to my eye, and the camera's pretty much ready to go. Now, I may have to do exposure compensation a little bit based on sort of the overall scene of the image, but I've done that enough. Most time I'm pretty good about sort of reading a scene and knowing where I need to set the camera before I get there when I'm dialing in the exposure compensation. So again, for me, it's about speed, and it's about making fewer mistakes. If I can automate one of those three steps in the exposure triangle, if I can set the aperture and the ISO and let the camera do the heavy lifting on the shutter speed and let it figure out what the shutter speed ought to be, then it makes me faster, number one, and it eliminates my chance of making mistakes, number two. Now, you may say, well, you can accomplish the same thing with shutter priority. So, in other words, you set the shutter speed and let the camera determine the aperture, and you set the ISO, and you can do that. But the issue I have with that, from my standpoint, my personal aesthetic, is I like to set the aperture because I really want that background to be out of focus. And if you look at a lot of the pictures I take, you can see it in these pictures as we're going through there. I just really like to have a wide open aperture. Picture on the left is a little bit different because that was shot with the 16 mm lens. So it's got inherently has a little more depth of field. That was shot with the camera trap, by the way, at 4 a.m. As that big buck cruise past. But as you look at these pictures, you'll notice that aesthetic that I really like of the background being out of focus. Now for nature photography, that's probably where most of my manual stuff is. I tend to switch over to manual when I'm not nature photography. When I'm doing landscape photography, I tend to switch over to manual. And so I think that particular exposure mode is valuable as well. We talked about all this. I kind of jumped ahead on my conversations. And again, in wildlife photography, I think backgrounds are critical. They're all sort of part of that part of that tapestry that makes up beautiful images. I think one of the reasons why I've had so many magazine covers in my life is I was able to crack the code and figure out what the editors liked, and to be able to kind of replicate that same formula over and over again. And what they liked were really creamy backgrounds that you could put text on top of that wouldn't distract from the subject of the image. And for me to do that is I've got to select the aperture. I got to tell the camera what aperture I'm going to use. And then I talked about all this where it saves me time, and I'll just let the camera kind of do its thing. And the cameras are pretty good. They're not the cameras are pretty good at getting the shutter speed. The Even though they're getting better, the metering modes in these cameras are still fallible, in the sense that sometimes they get fooled, like like a scene like this, where you've got a kind of a middle tone animal. It's just got a little bit of white in it, but kind of just a typical bird or typical mammal that's in bright light, but it's got a real dark background. Most of the time, no matter the camera, no matter whether it's Nikon, Canon, Sony, Olympus, whatever, the camera will see this scene and not get it right because it tries to bias to the dark background. And since all these cameras are calibrated to the middle gray, 18% gray, if you think about your histogram, you got the blacks on the left and the whites on the right, 18% grays right in the middle. So they all try to take everything back to the middle. Well, if in nature photography, everything's not right in the middle. You have scenes like this quite often. And then, so typically a camera, when it sees this scene, and my cameras did exactly that, and that's how I knew how to react to it. When a camera sees this scene, it will tend to overexpose the image. It wants to bring out more detail in the background. Well, one of the things I like to teach is you've got to expose for who the star of the show is. In the background, although a supporting character in this little movie is not the star of the show, the roseate spoonbill is the star of the show. So I exposed for that. So I had to tell my camera, because it was trying to overexpose it or add light, I had to minus exposure compensation or take light away in order to get that right. Another thing I've learned from Photo Statistica, when you're using things like exposure compensation, uh, I learned from the 85,000 pictures that I've used put exposure compensation on in my library. Uh, Almost 90% of the time, it's either usually overexposed to stop or underexposed to stop on exposure compensation. So it tells me the camera meters are getting pretty good. They can get close, but they're still not perfect at it. And the inverse of this is true. If there was an animal on like a snowy background, and we've all done this before, we've all taken pictures in the snow. where the snow looks gray and muddy, and that's because the camera is underexposing the picture in that case, and it's just trying to push everything back to that middle, that 18% gray. And so when you're taking pictures of the snow, we learn early on when we're learning how to take pictures that you have to overexpose pictures in the snow, so the snow turns out white, and then the subject ends up being appropriately exposed in the picture. So again, the reason why I like to use aperture priority, it just saves me time on that whole calculation. The only thing I have to worry about is the background dark or is it bright? And do I have to add in exposure compensation? And that's really making it dummy proof for me. I can go through and I can take pictures really, really quick without having to think about it. And again, it's just about building muscle memory to the process. And I'm just not that good at muscle memory when it comes to dialing things in manually. Yeah, here's another example, the really out of focus backgrounds I like. Number three, debatable, that I hear a lot when we're kind of driving around in the vans and discussing these things in our photo groups from time to time, is auto ISO. Are you a fan or not? And I believe that auto ISO, the way I shoot, I'm just not a fan, because even though I'm not a complete control freak, there's some things I like to control. I feel like my sweet spot on my ISO is usually between 400 and 800. I think that's where my cameras sort of work the best, and that's the good trade-off between a high enough ISO where you can get a high enough shutter speed in most cases to freeze action when it comes to doing wildlife photography. But auto ISO, I'm not a fan, and the reason, it's pretty simple. If you're shooting on a priority mode like I do, I just showed you 81% of the time I shoot on aperture priority. But if you're shooting on one of those priority modes, the auto ISO fights against you when you try to make changes using exposure compensation. And so, in other words, and I think it probably does the same thing on manual too. Well, I know it does the same thing on manual now that I think about it. So, in other words, if your camera is, you've got a bright background like this water here, and you're trying to overexpose the picture a little bit so you get some detail in the subject, and then the background is supposed to look what it's supposed to look like. Anytime you make a change on your exposure compensation, then your ISO moves to try to compensate. So it's your camera fighting you when you're trying to dial these different exposure adjustments in. It's your camera trying to fight you to say, no, this still needs to be, I still need to expose it this way. The most important tool you have in your arsenal when it comes to doing outdoor photography, whether it's wildlife or nature or just taking pictures of anything, is the thing that's in your noggin. And because a lot of times when you're using exposure compensation and you're trying to purposefully underexpose or overexpose a picture, whether you're shooting manual or one of the priority modes, your camera is going to be telling you this isn't right, but you've got to just trust your instincts and trust your knowledge of the medium to know that it is right. I can tell you, uh, I did a little demonstration the other day. It's kind of cool, where I just had the same light source and had the same subject in every picture. So the light source didn't change, the camera settings didn't change, nothing about the scene changed, but I had poster board for a background, and I used a green poster board for the first background, which green is kind of neutral tone. It's not black and it's not white. It's somewhere right in the middle. And then you take the green out and you add a black background to it, and all of a sudden the shutter speed changes. Nothing else has changed. The subject's the same. The lighting source is the same. Everything's the same, but because the background changes, it changes the shutter speed, which is, when you've got a dark background, you can take this to the bank. The camera is almost always going to overexpose the picture. When you've got a bright background like snow, the camera is almost always going to underexpose the picture. And the same thing proved true. I took the black background out, put the white background in. Nothing else changed, but the shutter speed changed because the camera is trying to compensate for it. Now, if you're shooting on these priority modes and you use ISO instead of the shutter speed trying to move, if you've got it all dialed in manual, the aperture is going to start moving, which when the aperture moves, it either makes it more sensitive or less sensitive to the light input you're giving to the camera. And so because of that, I'm not a big fan of auto ISO. To me, auto ISO is akin to priority mode, which that's just the control I don't want to give up. So I tend, and I know you can limit the auto ISO, but I tend to just set my ISO static, set the aperture static, let the camera decide what the shutter speed ought to be, and then I can adjust using aperture or using exposure compensation from there. And so again, I just, in an attempt to learn it and an attempt to be a better teacher for my students, I've used auto ISO before, but again, I'm not a big fan because I think it fights against you way too much when you're trying to properly expose an image in the outdoors. And so on that same in the same regard, the way I shoot, these are the settings that are changed from the least to the most. I change my aperture the least. I like that look of the, in this case of this wood stork, the foreground's out of focus, the background's out of focus. I just like that aesthetic. And it may not be for everybody, but I think it's universally accepted when you're taking wildlife pictures. That's the kind of look people are really going for. When you're taking pictures of people, I'd mentioned on this on the webinar before that I've done, uh, one of the first pictures I was ever inspired by and tried to learn that technique when I was a teenager in school, looking at Sports Illustrated magazine and seeing pictures of Nolan Ryan and Dwight Gooden when they're pitching on the mound and they're in perfect focus. The batter's out of focus and the background's out of focus. And I became enamored with that look. And that was one of the first techniques I ever taught myself how to do. So I changed the aperture the least in this scenario. I changed ISO the least too. And again, you may be thinking, and go back to lesson one or point one I talked about, you may be thinking, well, as the light gets lower and it gets dimmer, I've got to go up on my ISO to keep a higher shutter speed. If you use a tripod, you'll be surprised at how low of a shutter speed you can shoot wildlife. And it's all relative. If an animal's sitting still like this, I shot them at 1/15th of a second on a tripod, you can get really low shutter speeds. If they're moving around, that changes a little bit, but still the ISO remains static because I want to keep it in that pocket of ISO, because I'll tell you, I know there's all kinds of tools you can use for ISO. We'll talk about those in a minute. But I like keeping it kind of in that pocket because all this I'm talking about, if you've watched any of my webinars before, I'm a real believer in productivity when it comes to photography and trying to streamline your workflow so you're out doing the things that are going to make you a better photographer, which is being out in the field taking pictures. That's the thing. The practice is what's going to make you better. And so I'm a believer in trying to get this stuff as right as I can in the camera, so I have to spend less time messing with it when I get back home. If the post processing is your thing, and I do like it to some degree, but it's my least favorite part of the process, and so I tend to try to get it as right as I can. But that's also a throwback to when I shot film, because again, I'd mentioned earlier, I've been shooting pictures for a long time. Been shooting it. I don't mean this as a plug, but it's just a fact. I had my first pictures in a magazine when I was 19, and that was 1989. I had my first magazine cover when I was 20, and that's 1990. And so I'd been shooting pictures a long time before they were digital. And because I didn't have a lot of money to spend, and I'm, come from a blue collar family, and my dad was a welder by trade, and I'm the youngest of five kids, and on and on and on. Typical of what you'll find in rural America, money wasn't finite, and so I just had to learn to be as good as I can with the film I'm given. Because when I would order film, and living in a rural area, again, here's a plug to B&H. I'd call B&H Photo and order 20 rolls of film at a time and have them shipped to my house. And so because that film was a finite medium, I couldn't just outrun it like you can digital today. I had to get it right in camera. And so that same sensibility is carried on for me when I do my teaching. I think it's best if you do it right, and then what you have to fix later you can. But I believe the same thing about writing. When you're writing stuff, I think it's best to try to get it as correct as you can right when you write the document, instead of having to go back and edit. And I know some of the edits are necessary from time to time, but I feel better if I can get it as good as I can the first time. So settings change from least to most: aperture, ISO, exposure compensation is based on the light or the background scenario, dark background, light background. I'll dial on exposure compensation, and then the shutter speed, the camera sets it. So that's sort of how I work, and that's why I like aperture priority. That's why I'm not a fan of auto ISO, because I want to set all these things myself and then let the camera do what the camera is going to do. These are cool birds. This is a reddish egret, and the way they fish is they'll spread their wings out like that and create shadow over the water so they can see better. Of all the controversial things I say, this may be the most one: back button focus. And I led this webinar with this particular notion in mind. Is it a good idea? And this is, of all the things I talk about or all the discussions I've had with hundreds of people over the past few years on workshops is that seems to be the most contentious is this back button focus thing. Is it a good idea or not? I'll admit part of my thoughts on this is I'm kind of a creature of habit, but I'm going to lay out a couple of reasons why that to cut to the chase. I don't, at least with the cameras I use, and I'll explain that back button focus is such a good idea. But this is the one hot topic that the people that do it swear by it. The people that don't do it swear by their way of doing it. So this is probably the most polarizing thing that we ever talk about. Again, it's all in good fun and good natured conversation. But if you don't know what back button focus is, this is my Canon R5. You can see how all the dust in the viewfinder. I use these cameras. They're made to use and not sit on the shelf. But if you look on the back of these cameras, the autofocus, they've got an autofocus button on the back, and you can set up your settings where that to make a camera focus, that's you've got to push that button to make it work. I'm not a big fan of that because I'm so used, and this is the creature habit part. I'm so used to having the shutter button and just a camera activation button, my forefinger. I'm so used to using that for both functions to not only release the shutter but also focus. It's hard for me to get used to back button focus, but that's not the reason that I'm not a big fan of it. And the reason I'm not a big fan of back button focus, and let me clarify, or let me issue a caveat here. I think this is only a Canon issue more than it is a Nikon issues. Because if you look, I don't know if you can, I don't know if you, well, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but if you look at the autofocus button to the left on these Canons, there's a little joystick toggle. Then you've got a magnifying glass, which I don't hardly ever use when I'm taking pictures, but you've also got that Q button, which is kind of quick selection. And then you've got the round wheel at the bottom. And the way that the ergonomics of Canons don't lend itself well to using the other buttons on the back of the camera. So when you're using back button focus, you regulate your thumb to only a single function, and that's autofocus. And so for me, because the one button has the dual purpose, the shutter button of both autofocus and the shutter, it leaves my thumb free to dial in exposure compensation, to change the focus modes, to change the metering modes. I can do all that on the fly because with my thumb, I've still got access to all of these different functions that my camera can do and all these different settings I can change. If I switch it to autofocus, if I switch it to back button focus, then I've got to take my thumb off the focus to be able to make any changes. And then I may miss action when I do that. So that's the reason I'm not a big fan of autofocus, of back button focus. I mean, now one thing that's different, and I say this may be only something that's relegated to Canon, because and it's the way, and it's also goes in line with the way I shoot, because I do use exposure compensation, and I do use that big wheel on the back of my Canon camera to change that. If you shoot a Nikon, that's not even an issue, because with Nikon, the exposure compensation is by the shutter button. That's where you change it. And so, and I think with Sony, it's even in a different place. I'd have to look back on that. I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe if you guys that are listening shoot Sony, you can tell me that. So it's Sony. I mean, with Nikon, all of a sudden back button focus may make sense because you may not be changing as much stuff with your thumb on the back of the camera. So that's my caveat on back button focus. With the Canon cameras I shoot, and I've shot Canon cameras. I told you I started with Vivitar. I moved to Minolta when Minolta was still a brand. And then right before I switched to digital, I went ahead and switched over to Canon cameras. And then from Canon, I just went from the DSLR camera, or not the DSLR, the SLR cameras they used to have, the film cameras. I shot Canon film cameras for a while and eventually started using their digital cameras. So I've just stuck with Canon the whole way. But as my photography technique has improved and I've started using these different tools, especially now with mirrorless, where there's so much you can change, I like the ability of using my thumb where I don't have to take my eye off the viewfinder, and I can use my thumb to use not only the quick settings button, but also use the joystick and the big round button on the back to be able to change all that stuff on the fly. And while I'm changing it, I can still maintain autofocus and still be able to fire pictures while I'm doing all that stuff. So that's the reason why I'm not a big fan of back button focus. But if if your workflow and your camera workflow, if that's something you're used to and that muscle memory is built in, by all means go for it. So again, back to that map I showed you earlier, there's a lot of different ways to accomplish the same thing. I just can't accomplish what I want to accomplish most efficiently by using back button focus. But I think with Canon cameras, if you shoot Canon, there's an alternative, because on the front of the camera, which was typically relegated to the depth of field preview, I think that's what that button used to do. Anyway, there's a button on the camera that hardly anyone ever uses, especially depth of field preview. Now that you can do exposure simulation on these mirrorless cameras, I have found, and this is anecdotal, it's not scientific, I found that most people don't even use these buttons on the front of their cameras. And so a good alternative might be, if you don't want to use back button focus and you don't want to use your shutter, the shutter release finger, your index finger for focus, this is right below your ring finger, and that may be a good alternative to program that button to make it focus for you. So I've used that some. It seems to work okay. I don't know. I still kind of preferred going back to using my index finger to do both the shutter and the autofocus at the same time. So more pretty pictures. Love birds, as you can tell. Think they're pretty. That picture on the left right there of that anhinga, to me, if I could draw a background on every picture of mine that looked like that, there's just so nondescript, but it's so creamy and it's just a nice looking shot and it helps the wildlife stand out. That's the kind of background I would draw up for every picture I took of wildlife. I just love the way those backgrounds look. And again, that's why I shoot aperture priority, because I set the aperture, I decide what that background is going to look like, and I set the ISO and let the camera set the shutter speed. Okay. Last thing, I think this is the big one here. The use of artificial intelligence or AI tools in photography. And this is just kind of came up in the past few months. Is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? And I'll just tell you right up front, I don't know. I mean, I think it can be argued in some ways, since we've been using digital photography, in some ways we kind of been using some sort of artificial intelligence to manipulate photos. That's the only way I can wrap my mind around explaining the things like the healing brush and some of the other tools that weren't touted as AI. I think now in a way we're being duped to being told that some of the technology that was already available in these post-processing suites were AI, but or I think we're being told now they're AI, but they're just being rebranded as AI when they never were. And so the use of artificial intelligence AI tools, it's it's uh it's really opened a Pandora's box, because I've played with it some, and it's on like these mid journeys or these uh some of the other image uh generating AI systems you can use. Is it a good idea? And I think it really comes down to the context uh that you're using it in. I think it's if you're trying to dupe somebody into showing them something that didn't really happen or you didn't really do, I definitely don't think it's a good idea. And then I think another question is, how much is too much? And an interesting conversation I had with a group a few weeks ago. There's a really big photography contest, pretty prestigious, that I've been asked to judge in 2025. And so they were getting my thoughts on because they're looking at rule changes, and they were getting my thoughts on the use of artificial intelligence and how that's going to affect their contest. And I think the contest people are really, really concerned about that. And I think there's both an opportunity and I think there's challenges to AI when it comes to things like nature photography contests or any photography contest for that matter. But I also think there's some good opportunities. And hear me out here when I say this, because I think I've always been a believer that when it comes to ideas, if everybody's thinking the same, somebody's not thinking. So I always try to be that guy that thinks differently about things, whether my ideas are are just full of junk or whether they're valid or not. I at least try to think in ways that other people aren't thinking. And so this contest had a rule about their about what you entered that said, okay, you can only crop, I don't remember what the percentage is. Let's say they say you can only crop 25% of an image out. And so my thought to them was if you crop 26%, all of a sudden you're in violation of the rules. But what if you add 26% to an image? Does that violate the rules? I mean, if taking stuff away from the image, if you're removing branches with AI where a branch existed, but you're removing it, if that's against the rules, is adding stuff to the rules. And they're all of a sudden they start thinking in ways they'd never thought before. They're like, well, we never really considered that. So my thought, and this is where it kind of ran against convention, my thought is, and I think this is where the big opportunity is. My thought was, if you really want to keep people honest, have them turn in the raw file, because there's ways of validating those raw files. Just have them turn that in, because then you're going to see who took the time to understand photography, who took the time to get it right in the camera, who took the time, because I've seen this, I've judged a lot of contests, and social media, this may be the most controversial thing I say all day. Social media has been the death of basic compositional rules when it comes to photography, because things like Instagram, everyone center punches the picture. They put it right in the middle of the image. And so it's kind of killed it's killed composition and photography, and just people's laziness. I'm guilty of it too. Oh, you can crop later, but people's compositional laziness is coming out. So if you really want to see who the best of the best is when it comes to these photography contests, don't let them take away, don't let them add, get the raw image and then judge the raw image and see what you think from there. Because I think the cream will rise to the top. Almost make people think photography is like it was with film, with what you took is what you get, especially with slide film back in the day when I used to shoot that. What you take is what you get. And I don't know if they're going to adopt that or not. I thought it was reasonable to think, but I think the opportunity is, if you start thinking in those ways and just strip away any kind of technology you can use from a contest standpoint, strip away any kind of technology you can use to either take away from that image or add to that image, and it just the image that you took as it came right out of the camera. I think they will be able to see who the really qualified and the really strong photographers in this contest. I just think those will rise to the top. And then the people that should win will win, regardless of how good they are with some of these AI tools or how good they are with the post-processing stuff. So I think that's a good start. It may not be end all be all, but again, if you're listening to me say that and you're wincing, if you compete in contests a lot, remember I told you that I'm always been a guy that thinks if everybody's thinking the same, somebody's not thinking. And so I just try to think differently when it comes to that kind of stuff. And so the uses of AI in photography, this is an example where I used AI in this picture right here. I did this a couple days ago when I was getting ready for this presentation. This picture of a zebra in Botswana, originally it was cropped a lot tighter. I used generative AI to extend the background. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the use of AI in photography, everyone knows about the programs that promise miraculous results for sharpening and noise reduction. I have found they do work pretty good in some cases, not in all cases. A little bit goes a long way, but I think a lot of times, but for me, a little bit of noise in a picture doesn't really bother me. I think it kind of adds to the aesthetic of that. If you were to zoom in, well, first of all, in this zebra picture, there's no point in zooming in and really critically analyzing the noise, because in the real world, it doesn't make a bit of difference anyway. If you zoom in real tight to see the picture, it doesn't really matter. And another thing people have to think about is how your picture is going to be displayed. I think in the end, most people's pictures are displayed on a screen that big. And so I think some of the things we worry about in photography aren't really worries, considering how most of the people see our pictures and how our pictures are displayed. But I think the common uses are sharpening and the noise reduction. Lightroom has it built in now on the noise reduction, and I think they've got the artificial bokeh built in now. And so all those things can enhance the picture. But again, I think a little goes a long way. I'd mention on this one the canvas expansion. Honestly, I think if there's any good use for AI in my photography, it's the ability to do that when sometimes, because an animal's too close, it gets shot too tight and it doesn't really fit sort of my compositional sensibilities. And you can just expand the canvas a little bit and fill in that spot with a pretty seamless out of focus area. Now, I think that goes, I mean, it contradicts to some degree what I said earlier about, on the contest, if you're adding stuff or taking stuff away, they're both, in my mind, still kind of the same thing. And so I'm adding the background here. But I think in this case, for me at least, the way I justify it in my mind, I could be wrong about this. But when you're adding a bunch of out of focus blobs, it really doesn't change the context of the picture. It just kind of makes the picture compositionally better. But the canvas expansion is one way that you can use it a lot. Generative fill, I don't use that as much. You can though, where you can just select the area that maybe, let's say in this picture of the zebra here, there might have been another safari wagon back there. You can just pretty much circle the safari wagon, and then that generative AI generative fill will look at the space around it and fill that in. And that's a pretty good use for it. It all depends how you're going to use it in the end. I mean, it's if it's for editorial purposes, there's I think the I can't remember her name, Princess Kate. I think that whole controversy last week, if you heard about it, where she was doing a little bit of photo manipulation, and one of the big photo agencies or news agencies, they did a they banned that picture from any use because they said it was excessively manipulated. And I think it all depends on the use in the end. And does it change the context of the picture? If I was to add another zebra, or if I was to take away like a safari wagon in the back, I think it would kind of change the context of the picture. But I think by adding a little bit more out of focus areas in the background really doesn't change that at all. But I could be wrong on that too. I mean, I may just be justifying what my thoughts in my own mind. We all have a tendency of doing that quite a bit. And then I think the question is on the AI stuff is, where do you draw the line? And I think that's a good question. And I don't propose to know the answer right now, but here's what I do know. And here's what I think. One of the at least this is the way I think, and the people with whom I associate think this way too. There's something magical about pressing a button, hearing the click, and seeing that image show up on the back of your camera. I mean, there's something undeniably magical about that. I mean, you could do the same thing by shooting video, but there's something about capturing that moment in time when that moment had never existed before. That 1/1000th of a second had never existed before, and it will never exist the same way again. There's something magical about that in photography. And so there's something to be said about experiencing that, whether you're taking pictures at the top of your game or not, and you're just learning. There's something magical about being out, being amongst like-minded people, or whether or being solo and just doing something you love. I mean, truthfully, most of my photography takes place when I'm by myself. And I am someone told me a long time ago that if your vocation and avocation are the same, you're a blessed person. And I've been immeasurably blessed, because when I go out to take pictures, when I've got two ways I go out and take pictures. I go out and take pictures where I get hired to do so, and I'm feeding my family and buying all the things I need to buy to run the business and do all those things. And then when I'm out just trying to have fun and doing something for a hobby, I do photography as a hobby as well. And so I think my point is, there's something undeniable about being able to go out and just experience the sun on your face, and the wind on your face, and just seeing nature unfold in front of you, or seeing your kids or your grandkids playing soccer or playing little league baseball or some other sport, and just being out enjoying it. We've got the ability, if we don't yet, we're soon to have the ability. You can recreate all of that with a few keystrokes when it comes to using artificial intelligence and the image generators we have at our fingertips. But it's just not the same. And it will, as long as we're humans and we can experience human feelings and emotions, then no amount of AI will ever change the experience of just going out and doing that. So I think when it comes to where do you draw the line, I think there's no absolute answer. You draw the line where you feel most comfortable and where it's suitable for the way you're using your photography. But again, I think the big takeaway for that is just to go out and do it and enjoy yourself and have fun the whole way. And because when you see scenes like this, the big farm silos at night with the clouds streaking by, or the mama black bear in the spring, or even the icebergs up in Alaska, those things will stick with me forever. Just the experience of being there when I made those pictures. And I think, Derek, if you're there, I am ready for any questions that you have to throw my way. Oh, there you are. You're Derek on the spot right there.
I'm back quick
Yep.
because we do have questions. It looks like a couple people are on the aperture priority and exposure compensation
Uh-huh.
thing. So,
Okay.
um, I West joining us says, could you discuss exposure compensation a bit more, how you use it?
Yeah, so exposure compensation is a way that you can override, if you're using one of the priority modes, you can override what your camera says and be able to manually dial in an exposure compensation or an exposure adjustment to that. And so when you, if we put this in the context and nature of photography, if it's and it's really this simple. If it's let's say a white-tailed deer. A white-tailed deer is a middle tone subject. It's not black, it's not white. It's just the color of that is right in the middle of our histogram. And then you put that middle tone animal against a middle tone background, maybe a field or the sky or just a field of green or a field of tan grass or the sky or whatever. The camera will almost always get that right when when it's metering a scene like that. If it's a middle tone subject on a middle tone scene, the camera's, I'm gonna say 100% is going to get the exposure right. However, as soon as that same animal with the same sunlight shining on it steps in front of a bunch of trees that are shadowy in the background, it throws the exposure off. The camera can't get it right because the camera doesn't know it's standing in front of shadow. It's just trying to make sense of all this range of colors and all these exposure values that it's seeing. And so, and this works like clockwork. You can set up an experiment in your own house like this where you get a single light source, buy 3 pieces of poster board like I talked about, black, white, and green, and then put a teddy bear or some kind of stuffed animal up and change the background and make a note of how it changes the exposure on your camera. If an animal's standing in front of a dark background, the camera is almost always going to tend to overexpose the picture. And so in that case, I know that, so I've got to dial in that exposure adjustment or exposure compensation. And so if the picture is, and it's as simple as this, Derek, way I do it, I'll look at the picture and I think, oh, that picture's too bright. I got to take light away. And what's the universal sign for taking something away? Minus. So I dial in -1 stop on the exposure compensation. If I take a picture of a coyote in Yellowstone on the snow, the camera, because it's such a bright background, the camera is going to tend to underexpose it not almost every single time. Every single time, the camera will tend to underexpose it because it can't process. It's trying to push everything to the middle to 18% gray point. And so because the camera overexposes it, underexposes it, I look at the picture and I think that picture's too dark. I got to add light. What's the universal sign for addition? The plus sign. So I have to plus or add light back into it. So it's usually that dance when you're using exposure compensation. Again, all you're doing is adjusting what the camera says it ought to be. And it's typically only a +1 or -1. It's never hardly ever beyond those bounds at all in my experience. So I hope that explained it a little bit. But again, exposure compensation is just an easy way these camera manufacturers build into their cameras to override what the exposure says. You can do it manually. If the camera says that the shutter speed ought to be 1/100th of a second or 1/1000th of a second, you can always dial it manually because of the background to say, no, this needs to be 1/500th of a second. I need to add light to it. You can do that manually. But since I shoot aperture priority, I use the exposure compensation for that. So I don't know if that made anything clear, but I'll leave my email address in a minute if that gentleman wants to follow up with me. I'd be happy to explain it further.
Perfect. And kind of playing off of that, Sharon just asked if you can talk about metering modes because that kind of plays in also to the exposure compensation is how are you metering and how does that affect exposure compensation or your exposure in general? So if you could, if you can give a recommendation or what you think for nature photography, what kind of metering mode do you usually use?
So these cameras, they put in all kinds of metering modes, but in the interest of being efficient in the process, I hardly ever change mine at all. I mean, technically you can use spot metering and just zoom in on one little spot in the scene and meter for that. And that's an effective way of doing it too, but it requires you to change it. And if you forget to change it back, we're talking before the show started about one of the one of the things I was telling Derek before the show started is I don't know why we spend all this money on cameras and they can't make it adjust automatically for daylight savings time because my camera times are never right. I wish there was a reset button on these cameras too that you could push and kind of reset it to your default settings. I know you can do the custom function, but I wish it was simpler than that. But you can dial into like spot metering, but I think it's called different things in different cameras, but like and Canon cameras, it's called evaluative metering. In Nikon, it's called matrix. I'm not sure what Sony calls their metering system, but I like using that metering system that kind of surveys the whole scene. And I think for me, that's just a quicker way of doing things because again, I just know intuitively, and it's all about building muscle memory and just trying to be quick at the process. I know I can do it intuitively. I can look at a scene and know when the camera is going to be able to get it right. But then again, I know if it's got a dark background or a bright background, the camera is going to get it wrong. And so the exposure wrong. So at that point, I'll just dial in exposure compensation to compensate for where the camera is not going to get it right. So I would pick again, Matrix and Nikon, evaluative in Canon. Gosh, I can't for the life of me remember what Sony calls it, but it's just that kind of general metering that's sort of it's not the center weighted, but it's the next mode that kind of takes in the whole scene or most of the whole scene, and it does a little bit better job of understanding the nuances of shade and tone within a scene and gets you closer to a better exposure right out of the camera without having to dial in any exposure compensation.
Perfect. We had a couple questions on ISO.
Okay.
One for the aperture priority, if you prefer manual or auto, and another asking if there is an ISO that you find yourself using the most.
Yeah. So I talked a little bit about auto ISO. I'm just not a big fan of it because when you're trying to make exposure compensations on the fly, the auto ISO tends to fight against you. So for every every -1 in exposure compensation you dial in, auto ISO will put a +1. It'll just raise itself back up and fight against you on that. So I tend to use manual ISO, or not tend, I use manual ISO all the time. I'm not a big fan of auto ISO. So with that said, uh, I think for me, kind of and I say this is an anecdotal. I use that photo statistica to learn this about my photography not too long ago, but uh, 4 to 800 is kind of my sweet spot where I like to be most of the time. Maybe even 400 to 1,000. I think the files look the best. They require the least amount of work when you get them back. And now I don't can't always be that way. And luckily for all of us, the cameras are getting so good at higher ISOs and being relatively noise free. I find myself using higher ISOs more and more these days. But in general, if I'm doing everything else right, if I'm using a tripod or some kind of solid support, like I said earlier, you'd be surprised at how low a shutter speed you can go to and still maintain a low ISO and still get good pictures of wildlife in the outdoors. It's a lot of the things that we're taught these days are all based around you got to have these super high shutter speeds because you're trying to outrun you know no offense to anybody, but you're trying to outrun your ineptitude and being able to hold the camera steady because so many people teach now that hand holding is the way to go. And I'm just not a believer in that. I think using a tripod is one of those things. It's low tech, they're inexpensive, but it'll make the biggest difference in the quality of your pictures in the long run. If you like sharp photos, that's really the way to go because you can it just expands it expands the use of your camera beyond what's the 4-digit shutter speeds, you know, thousands, 2500, 12500 and up. You can use those 1/60th of a second, 1/125th of a second. You're just able to use more of what your camera allows you to use if you use all these proper, fundamentally sound photography techniques when it comes to shooting pictures of wildlife.
Perfect. Now we had a question from Christine asking about pre-autofocus. I'm guessing this is what she meant by preset for focusing. The pre-autofocus that a lot of cameras have now. If you have any experience with that, if you recommend it, how does that work with back button focus? If so,
I'm not sure exactly what she's talking about on the pre-autofocus. I'm not sure. So again, I'll leave my email address if she's still listening that she could I can maybe we could do a little deeper dive into that so I could help her out with that question.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll give my little unsolicited 2 cents on that. A
Okay.
lot of cameras now, especially with the mirrorless, it's really just about getting your camera to react quicker. So you're setting on a pre-autofocus, which is
Oh, okay.
going to
Okay.
use the
Yeah.
battery up more. I mean, that's why a lot of people won't use it. For tricky situations, it can be good. I think there are some situations. Are you do you lean on the side of technology, Russell, or are you more of a? I know there's a lot of people where it's like the technology is good, but it's only good in the right situations, and it can actually get in the way when it's not the
Yeah.
right situation.
No, I think the technology is good. I think it, but I think it shouldn't be used as a crutch. It's a tool. It's uh if I need to drive a nail, my hammer is an invaluable tool to use, but I don't leave all the thinking to my hammer either. I try to do the thinking myself. But yeah, so to dovetail on the focus part, if this was indeed the question, that I'll say too, one of the things that you can help manage your battery on your mirrorless cameras, because I know those are getting so much better too, but it's still a little bit of an issue. You still have to manage your batteries. Is all these, I say all of them, a lot of the telephoto lenses have focus limiters where you can set the lens where it'll only focus out to like 15 meters to infinity. And so, like, I'll use my 500 millimeter as an example. So let's assume the whole focus range is a 360-degree turn that internal lens has to make to focus. By turning that focus limiter on and only making it where it'll go from 15 meters to infinity, that lens may only have to turn a quarter of the way, the internal lens. And so it's a whole lot less motor movement that the lens has to turn in order to achieve autofocus. And the truth is, most of the time when you're using a telephoto lens to take pictures of animals, they're at least 15 meters away. So look at that focus limiter and try to find the one that's different for different lenses that goes from infinity to that number somewhere in the middle of that focus range, wherever it is on a different lens. And if you set it to that, that'll help manage your battery. It'll help achieve autofocus a lot quicker, and it'll just help make the whole speed up the whole system where you don't lose as many shots. If that
Yeah,
was the question. So
perfect. And Russell's gonna leave his email for you guys. So if you guys do want to reach out, I know that's something that a lot of time it's case by case. It all depends what camera you have. What are the settings that you do have available? Some of the cameras now you can program in faces. You can program in subjects to have your camera predisposed to lock onto that. So that might be something that's best handled on a case by case for those of you out there that do have a more specific question based on your own particular setup. You may want to reach out to Russell. Russell, we'll get to one more question here.
okay.
Thoughts on bracketing?
Uh, yeah, I think for landscape, I bracket a lot more than I do for wildlife because the wildlife stuff is happening so quick. I try my best to get it close. The beautiful thing about digital, if you're off a little bit, you can still fix it. But usually bracketing comes more when I'm shooting landscape shots. So I will do a lot of bracketing there when you have time to slow down and think about it, because landscape shots are notorious for having a bright area here or a shadow there, and you're just trying to, because the camera sees things in such a linear sort of fashion, there's not a lot of nuance in how the camera sees the scene. Bracketing is important just to try to get number one, get the exposure as close as you can to the way your eye sees it, and number two, if you decide to combine them later and make an HDR image, the bracketing is essential when you do that. So yeah, I'm a fan of bracketing. I use that a lot.
Perfect. Well, Russell, I want to thank you once again for another great presentation. I think we got to get it up on the site, but we do have Russell scheduled for something we're going to be doing up on the upcoming eclipse.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll definitely be exciting and have some great information so that everybody can capture that the best they can possible.
We're going to be here at Hackberry Farm. I'm knocking on wood right now, and everybody's sending out good vibes that we have clear skies that day.
I'm
But
hoping.
we're gonna have totality right over here at Hackberry Farm. So
Awesome. Well,
four,
we'll
four,
send that good
four,
energy out in the universe for you.
yeah, 4.5 minutes of totality. So I'm pretty excited about it. I got to tell this real quick story. I remember when I was a little kid in elementary school, like maybe second or third grade. I can't remember exactly when it was. I'd have to go back and look. And there was an eclipse happening outside. It wasn't as much totality as what we have now, but as I remember, it was a total eclipse that we were having in Texas. And our teacher, can't remember our teacher's name, but I remember what she said, took us outside and we're all looking up at the eclipse. And she said, take a good look at that because it'll be 2024 before this happens again. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to be an old man when that happens. May not even make it that long. And then lo and behold, here we are. It happens in what, 3 weeks?
It's
So
coming up quick.
I'm really looking forward to it. So it's going to be a fun time. We're having a little eclipse party for everybody here in the neighborhood. I say the neighborhood. I live out in the country, but all of our neighbors that live fairly close to us, we're gonna have them over and gonna have my parents over. They're in their mid 80s, so I'm looking forward to that because that's something that they normally would never slow down to see. But I told them the other day that you're coming to my house for the eclipse, so it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, we can't wait either. So we'll send that good energy out for everybody so that everybody can get a glimpse of this. Make sure you guys start getting your cameras set now. It's not just your eyes you want to protect. You do want to protect your cameras as well. So don't
Practice.
wait. Don't wait to get your gear for that.
Yep.
Well, Russell, huge thank you to you. We'll see you in a matter of weeks. But until then, this has been another rendition of the Bean Age virtual event space. Catch y'all next time.
Thank y'all.